Welcome to the Bad Roman Podcast. On this show, we talk with veterans, community leaders, Christians and non-Christians as we explore the entanglement of Christians with the state. The Bad Roman Project was created out of the firm belief that as Christians, we are called to follow Christ, not the state. Here is your host, Craig Hargis.
Hey folks, today Matt Mouzakis comes back on the show to continue our four-part series on his dissertation of Romans 13. And today we are going to cover Romans 13. In the first episode, we covered the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, and in episode 2, we covered one of the submission texts in 1 Peter. Romans 13 seems to be the one everyone leans on when defending their entanglement with the state, so let's see if we can put this to rest once and for all.
Let's go. Yeah. Left, right, left, right, left. We got our marching orders, man. Left, right, left, right. Would you rather serve God than serve Caesar? You feel me? Right. I'm just trying to live what he said. I'm just trying to live what he said.
Matt, how are you doing?
Good to be back on here.
I was going to ask you if you were tired of coming on the show yet.
No, not yet.
All right, so let's start here when the letter of Romans was written, because I think there's a lot of stuff in there that can I help folks understand why Paul was saying what he was saying, what was leading into the conversation and leading into Romans, the 13th chapter of Romans, because I think there's a lot of background that's missed when people just jump to this book and don't really understand the historical background of what's going on. And people who will not read any of that stuff usually when they're just reading the Bible.
Yeah, the background is so important to it. So Romans in general is dealing with kind of an interesting historical context. Paul likely wrote the letter to Romans from a city called Cancre, probably between 55 and 58 CE. Phoebe, who was a deacon there in that church, was the one who delivered this letter from Paul to Rome. But the setting of the letter really takes place kind of at the end of Claudius's edict, and that happened back in 49 CE, where he evicted basically all the Jewish, some say all the Jews, it's likely just the Jewish leaders, and the Christians were kind of tied in with them at this time. So in 49 AD CE, however you want to say it, they ousted all these people because of Josephus, who's an ancient historian, says that it was because disturbances taken place in the name of, it's pronounced Christus, which is likely a purposefully misspelled word, Christ. So because of Jesus, because of the gospel, there was disturbances, and so he the Christians leaders and the Jewish leaders were evicted from Rome. And then when Emperor Claudius died, Nero takes the throne. And he basically says, hey, my uncle was an idiot and you guys are all welcome back. And this was in 54. So about 5 years later, this happens. And so now in those 5 years, there seems to be even possibly a power shift in the church from primarily Jewish to primarily Gentile. And that provides some of the context for the conflict that's in the book of Romans. We see that in Romans 14 and 15, especially the beginning of Romans 14, we see that there's like this struggle going on in the church between what Paul calls the strong and the weak. And there's a lot of debate around what that means. But Paul's main mission in writing the letter of Romans is kind of pastoral and diplomatic. He's trying to bring unity in the church between these two groups. He wants them to actually live out the gospel of like Jew and Gentile being together in Christ. And specifically in Romans 16, it talks about that he wants to do a mission to Spain. So if these people aren't actually living out the unity of Christ in the gospel, then how is anyone going to believe the message of this mission that Paul wants to take even further to the ends of the world, the ends of the empire, proclaiming that Jesus is king? So he's really calling them to live the way of the kingdom, to live in unity as brothers and sisters in Christ, despite whether you're a Jew or whether you're not a Jew, a Gentile. And so that's kind of the context, the background for Romans is really that's kind of what Paul's getting at. It's just not a systematic theology letter that a lot of people think that Romans is. Yeah, it contains that, but really it's pastoral. Paul's trying to shepherd this church into actually living out the way of the gospel, not just giving them information.
Perfect. Okay, so and maybe that'll lead us into this portion too, because like I said, in our first episode was like Deuteronomy 32, the worldview in Romans. Okay, so you said, as we explored in the section on the gospel in the previous chapter, Paul begins the letter to the Romans with his gospel proclamation that Jesus is king in Romans 1:1-4. This is important to notice as it is the foundation for unity, and he builds everything else in the letter of the fact that Jesus is king. And he uses many imperial titles and concepts in these verses to communicate Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. Now, if he's saying that right off the bat in the first chapter of Romans.
Yep, first couple verses.
Man, people want to jump to Romans 13, verse 1-7, and to, like I said in the introduction, to defend their statism or their entanglement with the state. Why didn't they read the first chapter of Romans? We always talk about why didn't they read Romans 12 before reading Romans 13. Why didn't they read the first chapter?
Yeah.
The first chapter says that Jesus is king and Caesar's not, basically. I mean, I thought that was so funny when I read that, when I was going over putting down some notes for today's show. And I'm like, why don't we jump into Romans 13? He just said it in the first chapter of the book.
Yeah.
So we can end of argument. Let's move on.
Yeah, I mean, Paul starts out at the very beginning of the letter of Romans saying that Paul is a bondservant of Christ Jesus. And I know that you had Duncan on a couple episodes back, and he talked about that word Christ. That's just a transliteration of, and literally it means king. It's the anointed one. So Paul starts out like the whole book saying, I'm Paul, a bondservant. And we talked about kind of that doulos language in our last episode, being a willing slave. I'm a willing slave of King Jesus, is what he starts out saying. And I am called to be an apostle, a sent one. I'm set apart for the gospel of God, which is this, basically, that he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scripture concerning his son, who was born a descendant of David. So king language right there, according to the flesh, declared son of God. Now son of God was a title for Caesar. So he's saying that, yeah, Jesus is the son of God, Caesar is not. By the power of the resurrection from the dead and the spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ, so Jesus King, our Lord. Now Lord there, Kyrios, was another title for Caesar. So he's taken all these titles that people would have called Caesar and he's given them to Jesus. So right away, and Paul says, this is my gospel right at the beginning, that Jesus is king. He's the resurrected king, and Caesar is not, essentially.
And that's just, I don't know why that never dawned on me to even point that out. And I'm glad you did in your paper, because to me, it just ends the argument about what Romans 13 is actually saying.
Yeah, so like if we keep going with that Deuteronomy 32 worldview in Romans, like all the stuff that we covered in our first episode, kind of our little series here, when you look at Romans, basically verses 21-23 in the first chapter, we kind of get this where it talks about, really, it's talking about the humans were created as image bearers, and because they rejected the purpose God created them to, it talks about God handing them over. And this is the same language that is used in Deuteronomy 32 of God handing over the nations to the sons of God, basically putting an Elohim, son of God or whatever, over each nation. It's the exact same language that Paul is using here, that when humanity rejects God, he hands them over to something. So, which is interesting, because that wording in Greek is used also in the Septuagint. That's the Greek translation of the Old Testament in Deuteronomy 32. And there's a scholar, her name is Beverly Gaventa, and she says that this word never meant to be just handed over to something that's abstract, like a circumstance or a behavior or that, but it's really being handed over to a power. This word is always used to be handed over to a power. So when you reject Christ as king and you reject the way that he has us walk, it talks about being handed over to other powers. As you go through the rest of Romans, sin and death and all of this other stuff are seen as literally like demonic powers that the world serves. And I think that goes to like set up that to be free from that because of Christ's death and resurrection, and the entrance into his kingdom is pitted against living as a slave to sin. And I think that that sets up our whole argument of the governing powers of Romans 13, that they're actually demonic.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. I want to get to that. Do you want to talk about that now, or do you want to talk about the local context?
Yeah, let's talk about the local context a little bit, and let's maybe start with kind of the immediate context before the local context, which is Romans 12.
Okay.
Yeah. Like, people want to just go like often like just proof text and throw out the beginning of Romans 13, while ignoring the immediate context of Romans 12. Now, Romans in general is divided up into multiple sections. So Romans 1 through 4 is one literary unit, which kind of talks about Christ being the king, and that neither Jew nor Gentile, it's not based on like your ethnicity or your background. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Like, no one gets special privileges, right? But Jesus makes a way for Jews and Gentiles to enter into his kingdom. Then you got 5 through 8, which is all about either being a slave to sin or basically being part of Christ's kingdom. It's actually set up kind of like the Exodus, like you're in slavery, like they were like Israel was in Egypt. And Christ basically comes and sets you free. Romans 6 is all about baptism, going through the Red Sea, almost becoming his set apart nation. And that's through what Jesus did. And then Romans 7 kind of gets into the law. And then Romans 8 is all about really about the restoring of earth, kind of coming into the promised land. And Paul sets up Romans 5 through 8, just like the narrative of what we see in the Exodus, which is cool. So, and then the next part is really about Romans 9 through 11. He comes back to answer the question about, well, why does Jewish ancestry even matter? He's just answering kind of questions around that. But Romans 12 through 16 is also one literary unit. And so you shouldn't read chapter 13 without reading chapter 12, because that's where his whole argument starts, is in chapter 12, which leads into Romans 13. So Romans 12 is pretty much all about presenting yourself as a living sacrifice and not conforming your mind to the ways of the world, is how Romans 12 starts. After that, it kind of goes into spiritual gifts and that, but it's talking about us not being conformed, but being transformed. So not stop being like the world, but be transformed into the way of Christ. When we get to verses 9 through 13 in chapter 12, pretty much Paul is in kind of the end of chapter 12, like summarizing the Sermon on the Mount, which is kind of Jesus's kingdom manifesto. Verses 9 through 13 say, "Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor. Don't lag behind in diligence. Be fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Persevere in tribulation. Be devoted to prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints, and practice hospitality." So you kind of see all of this stuff all of this is angled straight at the church, straight at the ecclesia, straight at the kingdom of God, people that are living in that. When you get into verses after that, verses 4 through 21, it kind of talks about how the church is supposed to act towards those who aren't part of the kingdom yet. So, bless those who persecute you. Bless, do not curse. Does that sound like the empire? No. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind towards one another. Don't be haughty or prideful in your mind, but associate with the lowly. That doesn't sound like the empire either. Don't be wise in your own estimation. Never pay back evil for evil. Respect what is right in the eyes of all people. If possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with all people. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. That doesn't sound like the empire. If he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
It's funny because in our last episode, I think we ended, or I don't remember if we ended with the show with this, or we talked about it after we got done recording, but we're talking about the Bible Project. You told me about the series they're doing on the Sermon on the Mount. I started listening to it. It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But everything you just read sounds to me like Paul's just basically repeating the Sermon on the Mount. And when I was listening to that series on the Bible Project podcast, they had a question. I made a meme about it the other day. It was like, If the Sermon on the Mount was followed, would a nation state even exist?
Yeah.
And I'm like, no.
Nope.
I was in my truck on my way to work, and the question was asked, and they were kind of talking about it, and I'm screaming at my radio, like, no, it would not exist. It would not exist.
Yep.
If the Sermon on the Mount was followed.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. But basically, I think that like all of this is kind of a mirror of Jesus's his commands, his kingdom manifesto of the Sermon on the Mount, of the way that we live as kingdom people, how it looks so opposite, and it should look so opposite of the way of the empire.
Right, and there's this portion in the local context. I want to read this because I found this so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Archaeological evidence reveals that every neighborhood in Rome had a common shrine, monument altar called the, help me out here, Lars Augusti.
Lars Augusti.
Augusti, okay. At its crossroads where locals were required to pay tribute to the neighborhood gods for protection and to honor the emperor. Neighborhoods honoring the empire's policies of civic order would try to outdo other neighborhoods in honor of their emperor. This sounds like American politics to me.
My city's better than your city.
Yeah.
I'm more patriotic than you.
Yeah, right. Look how many American flags I have. But what we can tell is that the Christ community would have likely chosen to not participate in the Lars Augusti, and this would not have gone unnoticed and would have brought suspicion upon them. It would have been seen as competition with the local cult and challenging the honor of the local authorities, and thus would have provoked a disruption and contention in the local neighborhoods. Christians run around turning the world upside down again.
Yep, pretty much. Yeah.
The communities may have been tempted to stop paying taxes, which might have gone to support the Lars Augusti and support the local neighborhood patrols. Vigiles?
Yeah, Vigiles.
Vigiles, okay.
Vigiles.
And then you went on to say Christopher Furman believes the local authorities would have been the ones collecting the taxes. Then you said, though Lott does not believe the Lars Augusti amounted to an official state or cult. He seems to dismiss the spiritual worldview of the Jews and Christians, which saw themselves as a separate kingdom, living beside the old world and the overlap of the Elohim and empire, as we have seen in the previous chapters. These would have been tough waters to travel as an outcast group in the midst of the empire. They still had to live in the shadow of the empire, but not in the way of the empire. And then you go into Romans 13. Every begins with every person, every soul to be in subjection to the governing authorities. So I think that's a good segue into Romans 13.
Yeah. So kind of a lot of the in the context of these local neighborhoods, they had all these different neighborhoods in Rome that were divided up. There was probably there's about 1 million people that lived kind of in the vicinity there, and they divided them up into neighborhoods. They were almost like a homeowners association. Like they put what's called a vico magistrate kind of over that. It wasn't necessarily a government employee per se, but it was kind of more like a homeowner association president who kind of made sure everything ran the way that it should. And like when it says taxes there, taxes is in scare quotes in there because it was sometimes a lot of people think it was more like homeowner association dues that kind of went towards fire prevention, like the local like volunteer fire department almost in every like neighborhood that had one, every different district. And they didn't have a police force. It was kind of all like more like neighborhood watch, but all that dues money kind of went to support crime prevention, fire prevention, and the upkeep of kind of this neighborhood shrine, you might say, that was kind of to honor the emperor. I think it was, but a lot of it was kind of like the local gods of like your neighborhood, and if you pleased them, then it was seen to bring blessings on your neighborhood. But by the Christians not participating in that, they were seen as unpatriotic. They were also seen as almost atheistic because they didn't have all these different gods they worshipped. They only worshipped their King Jesus, and it was a different king than Caesar, because the gods and the Caesars kind of played together hand in hand. There was not a divorce of politics and religion in the ancient world like there is today. religion was politics. Politics was religion. So you were seen as an anarchist for not participating in worshiping the gods, and you were seen as unpatriotic at the same time for doing that.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Sounds very familiar.
Yeah. So that's kind of like the context, I guess, like back. So like if we get, do you want to dive into Romans 13 now? We can kind of start going through it a little bit by a little bit.
Yeah, let's do that. But I was going to say something. You mentioned something about the HOA, and I found that funny. I live in an HOA where I'm at, and I did not know that until I'd signed the paperwork for the house. So here I am.
Here you are.
But to what I had to pay like $300 a year to the HOA.
Yep.
And I have no idea what they do.
Yep.
I don't know what they do with this $300. I have no clue. Anyway, I thought that was funny you bring it up at HOA. So I was like, well, I could see they might have been sick of their HOA back then too. So.
Kind of, yeah. So let's tackle the first couple of verses of Romans 13. Verses 1 and 2 say this: every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. I'm reading from the NASB. For there is no authority except from God, and that which exists are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. All right. So starts out with every person being in subjection or submit to the governing authorities, some translations say. There, we talked about this last episode. You talked about it with Duncan also, about the word hupotasso. Doesn't mean obey. Can mean to put in line, as Duncan said, or it can be, as I kind of translate it sometimes, as voluntarily yield yourself. It's an interesting word where kind of we talked about last week, where it tells people in Ephesians 5 to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. The reason that it told us to submit in 1 Peter that we talked about last episode was for God's sake, for our King's sake, the Lord's sake. So yeah, here we also talked about last time that Paul could have used hupakaio, which means to obey, but he doesn't. Paul often reserves that word for God alone.
Yeah, right. So maybe I've read this wrong, but did you also mention in there, or somebody said that when we was talking about the governing authorities, may have also been talking about like these local authorities in these neighborhoods too, or not necessarily the Roman Empire, or was it both?
It's potential that they were only talking about these local authorities and not necessarily the Roman Empire. Because remember the context of Romans 12, where he's basically telling them almost like, hey, love your neighbor, don't make trouble.
Yeah.
Like all of this stuff. And now this is like, the Christians were an extremely small group at this time. And there's scholars out there that think, if you read back in like Romans chapter 2, like he's condemning some Jews for like robbing temples and things like that. And so there's this concept in Judaism called zealotism, which was kind of the, stand up and fight, take back Israel for God type, like mentality. And I think Paul's really coming against that in Romans 12, that zealot mentality. And he doesn't want them causing trouble in the streets or in the neighborhoods. So he's telling them, hey, the way that you actually overcome those who are your enemies or whatever, or how do you win over your neighbor, isn't by causing trouble in the streets, but it's rather through love. It's through laying your life down. It's through being self-sacrificial, like what it looks like for Jesus on the cross to overcome the world.
Right. And also I read too, to get kind of back to the local context, they discovered too that the Christians living there in that area at that time, they were basically living in like 4 to 5 story apartment building kind of things.
Yeah.
And they were all very poor.
Yeah. The areas of the Christians were some of the poorest areas of Rome that they've found.
Right. So they were basically living in the hood of the Roman Empire.
It's kind of interesting when we were talking about submit there. A lot of people who want to take that for obey, we have a lot of opposite examples in the Bible of people actually like disobeying the government.
Yes.
Right? Like Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt. They disobeyed Herod, right? When Jesus was a baby. We have Paul himself who disobeyed the Roman government on multiple occasions and was arrested. We have that in Acts 9 and 2 Corinthians 11. In 2 Corinthians 11, he's actually boasting about being in prison for his commitment to Jesus and the gospel. He's boasting about disobeying the government authorities there.
That's right. And then so what's so funny about that too is because, like I said, we get back to the first 7 verses of Romans 13.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's all they want to read. And I'm like, but he's in prison. Was he not in prison at the time of this, or? No,
he wasn't for Romans. Like Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, those books in the New Testament, Paul wrote all of those when he was in prison. It's not saying here, he's not telling people like that you should strive to be thrown in jail for the gospel. He's telling people like, hey, let's just live out the kingdom and community here and be a light in our area, and like don't make trouble in the streets. He's like, provide a good example instead of like always just having to fight back, That
reminds me of something too. I've had anarchists or voluntaries, mainly anarchists, that will tell me I'm not a real anarchist because I paid my taxes or I filed my taxes. And I'm like, I also don't have any desire to live in a cage either, because we do know what happens if you don't file your taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, they come and kick your door in and take you to prison. I'm not really, to me, if it means paying my taxes to live peacefully alongside the empire, okay. I'm not happy about it. I'm pretty outspoken about it, but
yeah.
I also don't want to live in a cage. I think I could do more work and be more productive out here on the streets than being locked up in a cage. But that's just my take on it. If that means I'm not a real anarchist, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. I'm not going to lose any sleep over that, I promise you. Hey, folks. Do you like salsa? I love salsa. I have come up with a fire recipe, and we have been shipping this homemade salsa all across the country. If you like salsa and want a cool way to support the project and spread the message of no king but Christ, then holler at us. You can reach us at badromansalsa@gmail.com or visit the official Bad Roman Salsa Facebook page and message us there. Thank y'all so much for your continued support. Now let's get back to the show.
So when it talks about governing authorities there, the expression in Greek literally means those who have power over you. Now, this could be, like you talked about, it could be these local Vico magistrates, homeowners association presidents, or it could be, he could be talking about the government. There is, since Caesar was the one who appointed this structure, they could see Caesar in the background behind that. Though they weren't government employees, it was established by Caesar. So that there's very much it could see that. But when you have exousia, that word for power or authority there, that's actually like a word that Paul uses quite a few times throughout the New Testament, basically for demons, principalities and powers. It never has a positive connotation in the New Testament, especially when it's used for the world. Right?
I remember when I first heard that, man, I'm talking about probably the first year we were doing this podcast, and somebody said that means that governing authorities meant demons. That's what they understood that to be back then. And you tied it all in really with the Deuteronomy 32 worldview too, and how the certain I don't know what you want to call it, demons, angels, gods, or whatever, were put on over certain nations, and then they just God gave them the authority to kind of bring them back to God, but then they kind of did their own thing with it, and now they just turned to evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So to me, that's demonic. I don't know, but the first time I heard that, and I remember the first time I had you on the show, I wanted to nail that down because I knew you'd been studying this stuff.
So these authorities really could see Caesar in the background of it. He could be talking about the local things. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that I don't think that Paul sees this positively, because he sees Christ as the king, right? So maybe we'll just get into this authority established by God. God is supreme. He's the king of all kings. He's the Lord of all lords. And people will sometimes take this part and be like, oh, well, nobody becomes king or nobody becomes president or nobody's put into a position of political power without God ordaining it, God establishing it, God putting it into being. But what we get here when Paul says this is something a little different than what a lot of people just think. So when it says that authority is established by God, this is what is a passive tense. It's the Greek word tasso, and it's in the it's a perfect passive participle is what it is in Greek. And really that word tasso was about derived from a military term. It was used about filing things, like putting things in order. I like how Yoder uses an analogy of a library. And he basically says that the way that tasso can be explained is really about like a librarian. The librarian doesn't write the books, right? The librarian simply puts them where they belong. So God doesn't determine what these governments do. He just simply has them for the time being, like just as in the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, God hands over the nations to be organized under these sons of God, right? It wasn't his intention that they would lead them astray.
Yeah, I have a picture of God go, no, what are you doing?
What are you doing? Yeah.
This is not what I intended for you to do. I think that he does that with a lot of us, though. So,
So Yoder says this. He says, by ordering this realm, God specifically, he doesn't say he morally approves of what the government does. He said it's like a sergeant does not produce the soldiers he drills. The librarian does not create the books he or she catalogs them on the shelves. Likewise, God does not take the responsibility for the existence of the rebellious powers that be or shape their identity. What the text says is that God orders them. He brings them into line. He providentially or permissively lines them up according to his divine purposes. So this illustration basically says that these powers are tools that God can use. They're not something that God ordained. And we see this all throughout like the Old Testament, that God would call even Babylon, pagan nations, like his tools to bring about his will at sometimes. Like he would use them to punish another nation if they were getting out of line. Like they're there. Babylon is going to do what Babylon does, but God can use Babylon at points to bring about some order. But it doesn't say that God necessarily, that this is God's end all be all plan to have empire.
So when you say God did not ordain it, and then I think you even used the example too when Jesus was talking to Pilate that he would not have the authority had it not been given to him from above. So if God doesn't ordain these governments, but was Pilate given that authority from God to be the Caesar or be in charge or whatever, or was
I think God allowed it.
Allowed it, but you don't think he placed him there like a lot of people believe that Jesus placed Donald Trump in the White House, and he's going to put Trump back in the White House.
No, so that's another interesting thing is like look at what God says in Hosea 8 verse 4. He says, "They, talking about Israel, has set up kings, but not by me. They have appointed princes, but I didn't even know it."
Okay.
So that's Hosea 8:4. So God is saying that you guys have set up these kings, but I don't even know it.
Well, see, and it's interesting too, because when I had Dominic Scarcella on the show, when we were talking about his book, he mentioned that portion with Jesus and Pilate, and what Jesus was referring to, he was not referring to, this is how Dominic explained it to me. He said it was not a power given to Caesar from God. He was given the authority from somebody above him in the ranks of the government. And I didn't know. I wanted to kind of ask you about that too, if you agreed with that or not, because that's the way Dominic explained it to me. And I never heard that before, so I thought that was pretty interesting too, because people will take that like, well, God gave Caesar the authority, and Jesus' gift telling him that, yeah, you got the authority from God to be where you're at.
Yeah, and I think that when they're saying that authority only comes from God, it's a way of actually undermining Caesar. That Caesar doesn't actually have any true authority.
Yeah, that's a good point. I sat there and I'm sitting there. It took me half a second to register what you said. Like, oh yeah, he doesn't really have any authority. There you go.
Like the only like power that he has is by God, but God is actually the one with power, not Caesar.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even like in the intertestamental literature, in First Enoch verses 46 verse 5, it speaks of throwing down kings that God did not set up. So, and then in Wisdom of Solomon, it talks about similar things in Wisdom of Solomon chapter 6. So,
well, that really flies in the face of the idea that every president or every king or every emperor was put in place by God.
Like God has guardrails of how far he allows them to go and if he allows them to do things, but the word just means to put something in order. It doesn't mean to ordain something.
Okay.
So just like a librarian doesn't write the books, she simply puts them on the bookshelf where it belongs.
I hope I'm not bouncing around too much and then it made you lose track of where you was at. Cause
No, I'm good. I think we're talking about resistance and condemnation after that, when it talks about whoever resists the authority has opposed the ordinance of God and will receive condemnation on themselves. Yeah, so this here, resist, means to take a stand. It's also a perfect active participle, which shows that this is a matter of the past, which is coming into the future. So there's kind of a wordplay going on here about resists and to be subject. They rhyme kind of in Greek. And Paul seems to be pointing out what I talked about earlier, the zealots here. Ben Witherington, who's a Greek scholar, is one who points this out in his commentary on Romans. And he points it back to the situation in the neighborhood, basically saying that Paul really here isn't saying that like anything that's pro-government. He's just trying to get people not to create trouble in the streets. That's simply what he's doing here. He's like whoever basically, if you want to say it this way, whoever is going to cause an uprising has opposed the ordinance of God, has opposed the way that Jesus calls you to live.
Right.
And those that do that will bring condemnation upon themselves. If you're going to pick a fight with Rome, you're going to die.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah, and you're ignoring the fact that Jesus called us to live peacefully.
Yeah.
Even alongside the empire. Like I think we talked about that in the last episode. Living alongside peacefully with the empire, it's just following the teachings of Christ. Doesn't mean we obey them.
Yeah.
You're not necessarily agreeing with them. The condemnation could come from God, but it's because He told you to live peacefully.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus told you to live peacefully.
Yeah. I mean, you're disobeying what God called you to, what Paul was telling them through the words of Jesus in Romans 12. When you don't live out Romans 12, like if you're going to go be a zealot and cause an uprising over taxes, over all these different things, we'll get into taxes in a little bit, but all of that, like, it's just a bad witness. And it doesn't look like the kingdom of God.
In the simplest of terms, it's a bad witness. Because it's a lot of the talk I see on social media. I don't believe that they would ever follow through with it. I think it's just tough man talk about a revolution. We need another revolution, this and that. I'm like, as Christians, that's not how we would behave. That's not how Jesus would want us to behave. I've said it over and over and over and over again that Jesus would not condone the revolutionary war.
And then even when you get into the thing that says the ordinance of God there, that's even a rare word that only occurs in later manuscripts of Romans. And some scholars really think that it means a temporary deposition. So it kind of points to the fact that Paul sees the principalities and powers as something that are fading away. There might be some temporary usefulness in it. Who knows? Their only usefulness is God can use them as a tool. But it gives no credence for people who are called to live the Romans 12 way to be participating in, I guess, the framework of Romans 13. I think he's just more giving this to say, like, hey, don't make trouble in the streets. Really, like, just live in the kingdom of God. Don't go with the zealot-like behavior towards your neighborhood authorities or even towards Caesar. You need to protect the witness of the kingdom community and get back in line with what I just told you in chapter 12.
So at that time, if he's talking to them, were these Christians actually trying to revolt, or were they just being outspoken about how they were being treated? Because I mean, you know me, I'm pretty outspoken about the government, and I'll probably always will be. And I know a lot of people in these circles that are pretty outspoken about the government. But I don't see any of us picking up a weapon to go fight the government. Like you said, if you cause trouble with the empire, you're going to wind up dead.
Now, I don't know how much was happening in Rome. We do know that a lot was happening in Jerusalem. That's basically what led to Jerusalem being destroyed in 70 AD, a few years after this. So it's possible, because that was a mindset within Judaism. The Zealots were a subsect of basically a Jewish political group.
Okay, I was just curious because like I said, I see it, a lot of the rhetoric on social media mainly. I mean, I don't see anybody actually forming a militia. Maybe I guess there are militias out there, but I don't think any of them are actually going to do anything. Maybe in small pockets, but that's probably what was happening then too. But at the end of the day, that's not what God called us to do, or Jesus called us to do.
So let's look at verses 3-5 then. It says, "For rulers are not a cause for fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have the praise from the same, for it is a minister of God for your good. But if you do its evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the ones who practice evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but because of conscience sake." That's verses 3-5.
Well, what does he mean by that? By he can bear the sword? I mean,
so bearing the sword there, so it's kind of more of order keeping, and let's get to that in a little bit, because it's not like the sword that would be used for capital punishment. Like, they had crosses for that.
yeah,
It was more of a small dagger, which was a sign in that time of ones who keep justice. I mean, ones who keep order. So we could talk about that some more in a minute, but
okay.
Let's start up at the top with rulers are not a cause for fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you have no fear for authority? This is kind of interesting. The rulers there, that word rulers is another word that Paul uses elsewhere for basically these spiritual beings, the principalities and powers. In 1 Corinthians 2, verses 6-8, he talks about the rulers of this age who don't have the wisdom of Christ and who are coming to nothing. So it's the same word that Paul uses elsewhere to basically say that, all right, yeah, the rulers and authorities of this age are coming to nothing. There. So yeah, what he says, basically this thing that, again, he's talking about some issue that's going on in this church where they want to cause trouble. And he's basically telling them, don't cause trouble in the streets. Like, he's not telling them to obey, but he's saying, like, hey, like, live peaceable, quiet lives. Don't draw too much negative attention to yourselves. So he's talking about fear there because, yeah, he's like, you don't want to get punished. It's essentially, he's like, this is not good press for my mission to Spain if you guys are making trouble in the streets and if you guys can't get along even within your thing. So he's doing a lot of correction, I think, here, actually. So when he asks the question, do you wish not to have fear of the bearer of authority? That's literally what it says in Greek. The answer to that is, do what's right, and you will gain their approval.
This indicates the fear of civil authority only comes from opposition to it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I was looking up.
So the thing is, like, we're not really, I think Paul is pointing to that, all right, so our allegiance is to Christ and our obedience is to him. And yeah, that will look like opposition toward the world sometimes, rather than sometimes people are just more about the negative of just standing up in opposition to that rather than standing up in allegiance to Christ. Like, we're doing this because we're allegiant to Christ. We're not doing this just because we want to oppose you.
Right.
Well, it goes back to the Acts chapter 5 that you bring up all the time. We must obey Christ, right?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what I was saying a while ago, because, I mean, like I said, I'm very outspoken and very loud about how the government treats everybody, and I probably always will be. But I also think, too, that if people were following the teachings of Christ, that these empires wouldn't even exist. And so I kind of take it, I could say, be outspoken about the government or the state, and at the same time be outspoken against the church for not following the teachings of Christ, or not following just the Sermon on the Mount, or just not following what Jesus was saying, because if we did, then none of this would even matter. And apparently this thing's been going on for a long time. This is not just a modern church stuff. I mean, if it was happening then and Paul saying, hey, just take it easy.
Yeah, and I think Paul might even have in his mind what happened. Remember, like, the whole context of this back in 49 when Claudius evicted, like, all of the Jewish and the Christian leaders from Rome. Like if they create a ton of trouble, just for the sake of creating trouble, is that going to happen again?
Right. And I think too that but I keep going back to stuff I'm seeing more and more these days. And I think people need to recognize too that they could be more of a use of God or used to the message of Christ as somebody who's living other than somebody who's dead or in prison. I mean, I'm all about being outspoken. I don't think that we should be silent. We should be outspoken about how the government treats us. But at the same time, you got to be ready to live peacefully, just because I think if you're in prison or if you're dead, you can't talk to your neighbor about what you're seeing. The government's the government. We already know through scripture and everything we've been talking about so far in this series that the government is under the control of Satan and his demons. So why are you trying to change it? Mm-hmm. And I understand being outspoken. We should be outspoken, but I think that what we're talking about today is so important too, that we have to remember that we have to live peacefully alongside the empire, know that they still exist. And they will until Jesus comes back. I've already come to that conclusion that we're not going to see the fall of the empire. It's going to exist until Jesus comes back.
Because, Jesus says that he's the one who's going to put every power under his feet.
I use that phrase collapsitarian all the time, and I don't even think that – I say it too. I said I think we're going to see the fall of the United States government in our lifetime, and I don't even know if that's the case. I mean –
never know. I mean, we're just called to live the way of Christ, live out that Sermon on the Mount, Romans 12, way of life, living as a community that exists next to Babylon, basically, but also being a light of the better way in their midst. And that doesn't mean that we're passive in any way. We're active in the way that we love. We're active in the way that we make peace. We're active in the way that we serve and love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. But I think Paul is calling them to be active in those ways rather than active in causing trouble.
Yeah.
Because that's the Romans 12 way of life. So I hope people don't hear me saying that, we should just sit back and do nothing. We're supposed to be a prophetic witness from the margins.
I do know what I see and what I hear among a lot of people. And I understand being angry, and I understand this, how being outspoken. But I think it's the Romans 12 part of this is so important to understand if we're going to understand Romans 13 and how we should behave.
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't think Paul in this is making some metaphysical statement about like the goodness of government or anything. I think that he's actually just speaking into a present situation of the church in Rome in the first century, and not making a whole political reality or social or ideal social order out of it. He's just addressing an immediate situation in the neighborhood here in Romans 13.
See, and I think that's such an important part too, because they want to take these few verses and just apply it to everything that in their view of government.
He's addressing a situation in a Roman neighborhood in the first century.
not in Memphis, Tennessee in 2024.
Yeah. Like if you take Paul's entire theology of the kingdom of God, it flies in the face of Romans 13 taken out of context.
Yeah.
So,
this is the first century, folks, that we're talking about.
Yeah, we're talking about a church in Rome in about probably 50-something AD.
Hey, folks. We have set up a very simple way to donate to the Bad Roman Project through spotfund.com. Just go to SpotFund and search No King But Christ. This has become necessary to continue to provide a quality podcast and keep production costs down as well. Just $5 or $10 a month will go a long way in helping us keep this project going and continue spreading the very basic message of No King But Christ. So if you like what we were doing and can find it within your budget, go to spotfund.com and search No King But Christ, and you can set up monthly donations or even donate one time. Any and all donations help more than you know. And as always, any donations above production costs will go directly to charities in Memphis, Tennessee. Thank y'all so much. Now back to the show.
Let's keep going. Bearing the sword, we talked about a little bit, and like Wayne Grudem, he's like a statist scholar. He's a good Bible scholar, but he's definitely very, I guess, statist. He says the sword in the hands of a good government is God's designated weapon to defeat evildoers. That's a quote from him. I'm like, all right, that's absolutely wrong. Preston Sprinkle, who's another great scholar, you should get him on your podcast. he rebuts that notion, saying using Romans 3 to celebrate violence, praise of government, and just war, saying that Romans 13 is not to be interpreted in the context of a warfare policy, policing nations in the world, but rather about the local situation, about keeping order in the neighborhood. That's from Preston Sprinkle. So he rebuts that, saying that to make this, like what we were just talking about, a whole thing of this is God's ideal, ordained way that he's going to rule the world, that governments are basically supposed to keep the world in line, or even other nations in line, is out of context.
I've heard that a number of times from Christians, when especially, well, maybe not even so much Christians, but when talking about it at work, when they're talking about why the United States military is all over the world policing other countries, and somebody told me it's to keep the peace. I said, what? They're dropping bombs in these countries. That's not peaceful. There's nothing peaceful about that.
That's not peaceful at all. Yeah. So remember, we showed before, I showed before in this paper, and I think we talked about it a little earlier, that these local police were not government officials, but basically a local neighborhood watch. So to interpret this outside of that context is actually taking this out of the context. So I guess we got to ask, what does the sword refer to? Does it refer to a function of the government, or is Paul actually talking about the Vico magistrate, so that local homeowners association thing, which would have kind of been, is Paul thinking more about the tax police, or is he thinking about the government here? Like those who come along and collect the dues. Like that right of the sword there, Greek it's makaria, was not an instrument of punishment, but it was a symbol of judicial authority. So which would tie in really well to those collecting taxes in the verses that are going to come after this in Romans 13, when we get into verses 6 and 7, I believe it is.
Does it sound to you like a voluntary type police force, or does it sound like a government police force that's using this? Or like you said, it's like a watchman. Or...
Yeah, I mean, well, Caesar said that every neighborhood should have these, or must have these, but it wasn't like a paid government position.
Okay.
Basically, it was to try to keep order in the neighborhoods, to keep crime down.
So are these guys doing this for free? If it wasn't a paid government?
I think I don't know if it was paid or not. I couldn't find a whole lot of information on that. A lot of times people did stuff like this because honor in the ancient world was almost as valuable as money.
Okay.
So if it was an honorable position, people would do it just because there had become social benefits that came with that.
Sounds a little egotistical to me, but okay.
It was the whole version. So we live in what's called a guilt innocence society, where we see everything through the lens of are you guilty or are you innocent? Where their whole society was based on honor and shame.
Okay.
So are you honorable or are you shameful?
Okay.
Not are you guilty or are you innocent? It's a whole different way of it. And we see ourselves as individuals, where an ancient society would see themselves as a collective group.
Okay.
And so this thinking of things from an Eastern standpoint, an ancient standpoint, we have some categories we need to deal with when we're thinking about some of that stuff. One thing that people sometimes get hung up on is that these rulers or kings or whatever you want to call it, governing authorities, are ministers of God for your good, is what it says there. It used diakonos, which is the word for minister or a word for deacon. It's used by Paul even as people using their gifts in the church. But we also see this phrase used in the Old Testament, and God even calls pagan nations and political figures his servant, such as the king of Persia in Isaiah 44 and 45, Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of Babylon in Jeremiah 27 and Jeremiah 43. The whole nation of Assyria in Isaiah chapter 10 is called the servant and also the club of my wrath and the rod of my anger, which is kind of interesting. Again, Preston Sprinkle says that Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar were pagan dictators. The phrase God's servant, therefore, doesn't refer to Rome's happy service to Israel's God, but God's ability to use Rome as an instrument of his hands. Just because God uses secular and sometimes evil institutions to carry out his will does not mean that God approves of everything they do. much of what they do, whether it be a serious sadistic practice of skinning civilians alive or Rome's crucifixion of thousands of people in the first century, does not reflect the law of Christ. But God can still use such godlessness because he channels evil to carry out his will. This doesn't mean he approves of evil itself. In fact, all the ministers of God's wrath became objects of God's wrath themselves, precisely because of the violence that they carried out. So essentially, he says that being a minister of God does not necessarily mean that you're a good guy. God can use ministers, basically our tools for God to use. And that's proven all throughout the Old Testament in the same use of this word.
That's interesting too, because that's just another word that's used to defend entanglement with the state.
And all throughout this section, like Paul is using words that kind of have mirror meanings or upside down meanings. They're almost like a parody. I think it's James Scott. He had this theory of parody of basically going back and forth between a public and a hidden voice in this Romans 13 of basically if a Roman soldier, let's say, or a Roman politician looked on to this, they would see like, oh, well, this might look like it's like happy and approving of Rome and society, but really when you read it in combination with like Romans 12 and see how they use some of these overlapping concepts, Paul's like doing this backwards thing, almost like a backhand slap to Rome. And it's called kind of like two voices in the text. It's an interesting article that I read. I just thought it's kind of this double voice thing. There's like a hidden message almost behind the thing, like actually calling Christians not to obey the government, but obey Jesus, like all throughout it. So it's kind of funny that like it says it's a minister to good, but like shortly after this letter was written, Nero was known for dipping Christians in tar and lighting them on fire to light up his garden parties.
Yeah.
In the name of keeping peace.
I think that's where frustration comes in with me when people just stop at these few verses and use it to defend their stuff, and then because there's nothing about what Paul's saying that is in defense of governing authorities behaving that way. It seems like everything that he's pointing to is just live peacefully, try to stay as unnoticed as possible. Even like we were talking about in the neighborhood, they were trying to outdo each other by celebrating these emperors and stuff, and the Christians would not participate, but was going to probably it was going to be noticed, But so I think that's a fine line for Christians to try to walk through. Like, okay, live peacefully, but do not participate in this stuff either. Because I wonder too if like every Christian just kind of stepped away from the state, stepped away from politics, and walked away from all of that, would it go noticed? Would it be unnoticed by? It would certainly be noticed by the politicians because they use Christians as a voting bloc.
Yeah. So I think kind of in all of this, Christians should voluntarily yield. Like we're not supposed to cause trouble, like to avoid the consequences of the state. But this should be couched in behavior of, bearing light in the midst of the world rather than kind of outright disobedience to the state. So if it doesn't conflict, if what the state's asking us doesn't conflict or bring about disobedience to Jesus, our King, then by all means, obey it, right?
Yeah.
Like we're not here to cause trouble. But we're naturally, by following Jesus, gonna cause trouble.
Well, it's funny too because a lot of the laws of the state are things that they break on their own. They break these laws all the time. They tell us, like God says, "Thou shalt not murder." There's a penalty of prison or death if you commit murder, and the state will prosecute you. But then the state murders people all the time. Then you could go to prison for theft, but then the state steals from you. God says, "Thou shalt not steal." I mean, yeah, there's a lot of things that there's a lot of laws that we can obey from the state that God would approve of. I mean, it's not, but like, yeah, if it does come in conflict with the teachings of Christ, I wonder sometimes what those consequences would look like.
Yeah. I think verse 5 is interesting. It says, therefore, it is necessary to be in, it says subjection here. That's hupatasso again. So submission, yielding, not because of wrath, but because of conscience sake. That conscience sake is really interesting because Peter, what we talked about last week, uses conscience quite a few times in his letter as a synonym for allegiance to God's kingdom. It's not just the decision between right and wrong, but when you kind of get down to it, it's about loyalties and a way of life, a correct, a lined up way of life. So because of, you could say, I'm like, based on Peter's usage of it and other usages in the first century, Michael Heiser has some really good research into this word conscience, and you could use allegiance as a substitute pretty much for that word as well. So it says basically, it is necessary for us to be in submission, not because of wrath's sake. And that goes back to not because of the government's sake, because it was just talking about the government bearing the sword in wrath, but because of allegiance's sake, allegiance to our king. That's the reason we do it. It's this very same thing that Peter said is submit to the kings for the Lord's sake, because we're allegiant to a different king. So we're obeying our king, and if he asks us to do this, then yes, we do it because of our king, not because they demand our obedience. So let's get into taxes, I guess.
Yeah.
And then we'll wrap it up.
Let's end on a good note, a fun note. Let's talk about taxes.
Yeah. So verses 6 and 7. Because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God. So that's that word that we talked about before. Diakonos doesn't necessarily mean positive or negative. It just means they're tools of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due to them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to fear, honor to whom honor. So there's a lot going on here. Taxes, the word taxes here is phoros. It was kind of the general toll, tax for goods. Paul asks the Roman church, is he asking them to pay the taxes? Or is he more likely saying pay your homeowners association dues? Because that was the same word they used for that.
That's interesting. Well, let me ask you this. What does that mean when, like, Jesus said, pay tax, give unto Caesar what is Caesar? I mean, we've talked about this. We know what belongs to Caesar, what belongs to God. But
render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's.
But that was the context of, because they were trying to ask him about taxes.
Yeah. So essentially, I don't think Jesus is saying pay your taxes in that thing. He's just saying, like, not as like a policy. He's saying, like, whose picture's on this? Whose image is on this coin? He's like, it's Caesar's. Like, give Caesar's stupid coin back then. He's like, whose image is on you?
I laugh like that because I've said for the longest time that Jesus would be a snark in that whole exchange.
Yeah.
Give Caesar his stupid coin back. Oh my God.
He's got his picture on it. Give it back to him.
Sorry, listeners. That tickled me. Boy, that got me right.
But then Jesus says,
wow.
Like, give to God what is God's. He's talking also about the image there. He's like, whose image are you created in? So you're not created in Caesar's image. Maybe that coin is, but so give him that coin. But you're created in God's image. So give your entire self to God, because that does not belong to Caesar. You don't belong to Caesar.
Wow. I hadn't laughed that hard in a long time. That was funny.
It talks about, like, giving to each what they're due, which I think Paul's audience would have known about Jesus's words about rendering. He's using that exact same word. It's a hyperlink back to when Jesus was questioned about taxes. You say, render all what is due, tax to whom tax is due. So give Caesar's stupid coin back to Caesar, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear is due. Any Jew in the audience, anyone who is a Christian would know that we fear God alone, right? So fear is honor to whom honor is due. We honor all people made in the image of God. And that goes back to what we talked about in the last episode. So really, he's saying here the same thing that Jesus said when he was questioned about it. He's like, yeah, like, they can have their stupid coin back. Give it to them. If he's talking about taxes, or he's saying, like, hey, don't cause trouble. Like, pay your homeowners association dues, right? Like, it's better that you're a good witness and do this than it is for, like, you small little group of Christians to be making trouble with the local neighborhoods. And this whole thing is about the witness of this community so that they can be a launch pad for the gospel to go to Spain. Remember, that's the whole context of the whole letter. So it makes sense in combination with Romans 12 And his whole thing in Romans 12 is all about living the Sermon on the Mount way of life, the way of love without hypocrisy, the way of putting others above yourself, the way of turning the other cheek, of outdoing one another in honor. Like that whole thing is that's the way that Christians are doing. And the other thing that's interesting, Romans 12 has like first person language, like use and you do this type stuff. But when you get to Romans 13, it's they and them. He's distinguishing between the two chapters of two different ways to live, two different communities, though they live side by side. So Romans 13 is not about the Christian, and it's not even a prescription for how governments should be run or the justifying the right for a Christian to participate in it. But it's saying that it's a total different kingdom when you actually look at the pronouns, the possessives, everything else it's a them and us thing.
And one more thing I want to say about the whole coin thing, the taxes, is this. So it was pointed out to me one time that Jesus was not concerned with money. He could find money in the mouth of a fish.
Yeah.
And so when you said give Caesar a stupid coin back, it was like Jesus didn't care about it. It was not, money was not important to him.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of comes back to, I think, like Jeremiah 29, like how like Jeremiah calls the exiles to live in Babylon is very much what Paul's doing, the same thing here in Romans 12 and 13. In Jeremiah 29, it says this, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them, plant gardens, eat their produce, take wives, become fathers of sons and daughters, take wives for your sons, give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons, and multiply there, do not decrease. Seek the welfare of the city I have sent you in exile, and pray to the Lord on behalf of it, for in its welfare you will have welfare." So he's saying, like, don't seek the bad of Babylon, metaphorically, of Rome, but he's like settle down and do the kingdom thing, you know? He doesn't say here, go work for Babylon. He's just say, pray for its welfare. Because if it's doing good, then you're going to do good. But it doesn't say that, like, you need to go become a politician or join the police or anything else.
Yeah, become a cop or even put any of them in power. It's not saying that either.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole thing, I think, is seen, like, Paul's, like, conclusion to all of this is in verse 8, where he says, "Owe nothing to anyone except love for one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law."
There you go. And
that's the whole thing. The connection of loving one another in the church and to neighbors outside of it, rather than that's like the whole thing. That's his summary of the end of Romans 12 and 13 is it's not a theology of church and state. It's a theology. It's rather render unto God what is God's, which is God is love. And we're called to love and seek the welfare of our neighbor. Paul's more interested in the relationships and the image of the church in Rome among the pagan neighbors than he is about an order of society under government and all of this type of stuff. He's more concerned about the relationships between the church and those in the neighborhood here. He's not, I don't think, even speaking of like an ideal for government or anything like that.
I think that's a good place to end. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think there's like some just wrap up. There's some distinctions that we see between Romans 12 and 13 that don't line up together. Like Romans 12, it says, "Never pay back anyone evil for evil and be at peace with all men." And the whole purpose of Romans 13 is to be in submission because of the wrath of the empire. So those don't line up together, right? Romans 12 says not to take revenge, leave room for God's wrath. Revenge is mine, says the Lord. Where in Romans 13, it says that basically these authorities don't bear the sword for nothing, that they're avengers who bring wrath. Where in Romans 12, it calls the church to let God be the one who brings wrath. Romans 12 talks about feeding your enemy. You know, if he's thirsty, give him a drink. In doing so, you'll heap burning coals on his head. But in Romans 13, basically, all those who basically oppose the empire will receive condemnation. It's the opposite. It's like, even if your enemy condemns you, feed him, clothe him, give him a drink. That's the way of the church, where the way of Romans 13 is all basically who oppose it are getting condemned. They're opposites. Romans 12, overcome evil with good. Romans 13 says, the rulers are not a cause of fear for good, but for evil. It does not bear the sword for nothing. So there's these opposites between 12 and 13. 12 is the way of the church and the way that we're supposed to live. 13 is simply a way of like contrasting that, saying that, hey, well, don't go making trouble because this stuff is going to happen. So if you obey Romans 12, you don't have to worry about Romans 13.
There you go. Let's try that. Let's see what happens. Well, Matt, I appreciate that. And next week or the next episode, we publish every 2 weeks, everybody knows, but we're going to talk about Revelation 13, the Lamb and Beast conflict text. And so that'll be an interesting way to end this series. And before I let you go ahead and tell people they can find Expedition 44 again and reach out to you if they want to read your dissertation. We'll probably repeat that every episode, but just in case people skip around.
Yeah. Matt at expedition44.com is my email. You can email me there. Expedition44.com. We have links to our episodes, posted articles. You can find us on YouTube, any podcast app.
And NoKingButChristNetwork.com as well.
Yeah, No King But Christ Network. Yeah. Us, Bad Roman, Rival Nations, and a bunch of other friends on there.
Awesome, man.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Bad Roman Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts to never miss an episode. And while you're at it, if you like what you heard, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, it really helps people find us. 100% of donations are given to local charities in Memphis, Tennessee. To learn more about the Bad Roman Project and to find show notes, please visit thebadroman.com.